Every marriage holds its secrets, but theirs was the foundation upon which the house was built. He offered her a name to protect her from the world, while she unknowingly threatened the carefully constructed lie that protected him. For a man who lives by control, the most dangerous secret of all is a heart that has begun to beat for the one person it shouldn't. The chandeliers of the Redemption Town Hall cast a mercilessly bright light, polishing the veneer of polite society to a high sheen. From his position near the wall, Silas Blackwood was a master of this world, a man carved from the very granite of the surrounding mountains, imposing, unmovable, and respected. His black coat was immaculate, his posture a rigid line of control. He was a pillar of the community, the owner of the largest ranch in the valley, a man whose word was currency and whose silence was a command. And on his arm, a wife, a girl, really. Isabella, all of 18, her hand resting on his sleeve with the weight of a captured bird. Their marriage, a month old, was the talk of the town, a practical, charitable act. Silas Blackwood, rescuing the orphaned daughter of a ruined friend from a life of destitution. It was a transaction of survival for her, and for him, the acquisition of a quiet, respectable mistress for his grand, empty house. Their public interactions were a carefully rehearsed play of propriety, a shared glance, a formal nod, a chill that everyone mistook for dignity. He watched her now, as she spoke with the mayor's wife, her smile a pale, lovely mask. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had allowed himself to acknowledge, with eyes the color of dusk and a stillness that mirrored his own. But where his was a stillness forged in discipline, hers was the quiet of a wild thing gone to ground. He had offered her his name, his protection, the unassailable fortress of his reputation. In return, he had expected her to be a ghost in his life, a silent presence to quell the town's gossip about the solitary 30-year-old rancher. He had not expected the unnerving pull he felt whenever she entered a room, a dangerous current that threatened to erode the foundations of the life he had so carefully constructed. He had a secret, a vow made in blood and shadow years ago, and this girl, with her quiet grace and haunted eyes, was a temptation he could not afford. The music swelled, and couples began to move onto the dance floor. He felt her gaze on him from across the room. A silent question. Duty demanded he ask her to dance. He straightened his shoulders, the motion stiff, and began to move toward her, each step a reluctant march into the heart of his own private peril. To the world, he was the respectable husband. But in the secret, guarded chambers of his own heart, he was already a man on the verge of transgression. The facade of the town hall dissolved the moment the heavy oak door of their ranch house closed behind them, but it was not replaced with intimacy. Instead, a formal, yawning distance settled between them, a silence more profound than the one they shared in public. The house was vast, the corridors long and shadowed, and they were two strangers orbiting a cold, dark star. Silas retreated to his study, a room of leather and ledgers, his sanctuary of control. Isabella disappeared into her wing of the house, a place he had never entered. This was the arrangement. Separate lives under one roof, a marriage in name only. It was safe. It was necessary. 2 weeks into this cold peace, a storm broke over the valley. It was a violent, theatrical thing, the sky splitting open with a fury that rattled the very bones of the house. Thunder cracked like a whip, and the wind howled a mournful, predatory song round the eaves. Silas, working late over his accounts, found the familiar noise a comfort, a reflection of the tightly controlled chaos within his own soul. But then he heard another sound, a small, sharp cry, quickly muffled. It was from her wing. He told himself to ignore it. Their contract did not include comfort. She was not his concern beyond the provision of food and shelter. But the sound came again, a desperate animal whimper of fear that slipped through the cracks of his resolve. With a curse, he pushed back his chair and lit a lamp, the small flame flickering against the oppressive dark. He walked the long, silent corridor to her rooms, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The door to her bedchamber was ajar. He pushed it open to find her huddled in the center of the room, a quilt wrapped around her, her body trembling with each clap of thunder. She was staring at the window, where lightning bleached the world white for a jagged, terrifying second. "The storm will pass," he said. His voice was rough, unused to softness. She flinched, scrambling to her feet as if caught in a shameful act. "Mr. Blackwood, I am sorry. I did not mean to disturb you." Her voice was a threadbare whisper. He saw then that her fear was not a simple fright. It was a deep, primal terror, her eyes wide and dark, with a memory he could not access. The distance he had so carefully cultivated felt, in that moment, like a form of cruelty. This was the inciting incident, the unguarded moment that would change everything. He set the lamp down on a dresser, his shadow leaping up the walls. He walked toward her, and for the first time, he deliberately crossed the invisible line that separated their worlds. "Here," he said, his voice still gruff, but the command was gone. He reached out, and before he could stop himself, took her hand. Her fingers were like ice, trembling in his. He led her away from the window, to a chair tucked into the far corner of the room, a place where the storm's fury was a muted roar instead of a visceral threat. He knelt before her, still holding her hand, his thumb moving in a slow, steady circle over her knuckles. It was a simple, grounding touch, but for them, it was a cataclysm. The shock of it, the unexpected warmth, passed between them like a current. He looked up at her, and in the flickering lamplight, he saw not the child bride or the business arrangement, but a woman, vulnerable and terrified. And she looked at him and saw not the cold, imposing rancher, but a man offering a small, shocking piece of himself. The thunder cracked again, but this time she did not flinch. Her eyes were locked on his, and in that shared, dangerous glance, a new and far more terrifying storm began to gather. The storm passed, but the atmosphere in the house remained charged, thick with the memory of that accidental, deliberate touch. The carefully drawn lines of their arrangement had been blurred, and a tense, watchful awareness now existed between Silas and Isabella. They returned to their separate orbits, but now they were acutely conscious of each other's gravity. A closed door was no longer just a barrier. It was a question. A shared hallway was a space of breathless, risky potential. Their communication became a thing of whispers and shadows, a language of stolen moments. He began to leave a lit lamp in the main hall at night, a silent bulwark against the darkness he now knew she feared. She, in turn, started leaving a single perfect wildflower from the prairie in a small vase on his study desk each morning. No words were exchanged, but the messages were as clear as a shouted confession. "I see your fear. I will guard you. And in return, I see your solitude. I will bring you light." The longing was a constant, simmering heat beneath the surface of his restraint. He found himself listening for the soft rustle of her skirts, the quiet hum of a song she sometimes sang while she worked in the kitchen. One afternoon, he entered his study to find her there, dusting his books. She was reaching for a high shelf, her body gracefully extended, and on the air was the faint, clean scent of lavender and rain. He stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. She turned, startled, a blush creeping up her neck. "Forgive me," she said, her voice low. "I thought you were out." "It is your house, Isabella," he said, the words feeling strange and new on his tongue. "You need not ask for forgiveness for being in it." His gaze fell to the book in her hand. It was his own worn copy of sonnets from the Portuguese. He watched as her thumb stroked the gilded title, a small, unconscious caress. "My mother used to read this to me," she said softly, a confession disguised as a simple statement. He took a step into the room. Which one was her favorite? The question was a risk, an invitation into a past he had no right to. She looked down, her lashes dark against her cheek. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways, she whispered, the words a secret between them. She said it was a foolish, romantic notion. And what do you think? He pressed, his own voice now a murmur. She finally looked up, her dust-colored eyes meeting his. I think, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its inherent, daring strength, that it is perhaps the only notion worth counting. The air crackled. The room was filled with the ghosts of poets and the tangible, dangerous presence of their own burgeoning, forbidden feelings. He wanted to cross the space between them, to take the book from her hands, to feel the warmth of her skin, but he held himself rigid, a prisoner of his own secrets. This was their new reality, a life lived in the charged spaces between words, in the double meanings, in the stolen glances across a dusty, sunlit room. The passion was simmering, and the restraint was beginning to crack. Every shared silence, every loaded phrase, was another step toward a precipice he had sworn he would never approach. On the far side of the sprawling ranch house, beyond the line of skeletal aspens, lay a walled garden. It was a place of secrets, choked with weeds and forgotten roses, its gate secured by a heavy, rusted lock. It had been his mother's sanctuary, and since her death, Silas had forbidden anyone from entering, leaving it to crumble into a picturesque decay. It was a monument to his grief, a physical manifestation of the locked-away, overgrown parts of his own heart. One sun-drenched afternoon, seeking a moment's respite from the relentless tension in the house, he walked the perimeter of the garden, his hand resting on the warm, crumbling stone of the wall. It was then he heard it, the faint, unmistakable snip of shears. A cold dread washed over him. He moved silently to the gate, peering through the rusted ironwork, and he saw her, Isabella. She was in the heart of his forbidden territory, kneeling in the dirt, her face smudged, a determined set to her jaw as she carefully pruned a dead branch from a wild rose bush. She had found a way in, through a section of wall that had collapsed inward. His first instinct was a hot surge of anger, a violation of his one explicit rule. He rattled the gate, and she looked up, her eyes wide with fear, like a startled doe. She scrambled to her feet, dropping the shears. Silas, she breathed, the use of his given name a shock. I can explain. He said nothing, his face a thunderous mask as he fumbled with the ancient key he always carried, a key he hadn't used in a decade. The lock groaned in protest, but finally gave way. He swung the gate open and strode toward her. She held her ground, lifting her chin in that way she had, a flicker of defiance in her fear. This place was sad, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was beautiful once. It wanted to be beautiful again. He stopped before her and looked around. He saw not a desecration, but a transformation. She had cleared the weeds from a small patch, revealing the original flagstones of a path. She had coaxed a few stubborn pale pink roses back to life. She hadn't destroyed his monument to grief. She had offered it a resurrection. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a profound, aching sense of wonder. She had seen the sorrow in this abandoned place, and had not run from it, but had instead chosen to cultivate it, to bring it back into the light. She had done for the garden what she was, unknowingly, doing to him. This became their secret. He did not forbid her from returning. Instead, the following evening, as she sat reading by the fire, he walked over to her and silently placed the heavy, ornate iron key on the table beside her. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The gesture was a confession, a surrender. It was the key to his mother's garden, but they both knew he was giving her the key to something far more guarded. The garden became their sanctuary, the one place they could exist beyond the suffocating roles of rancher and wife. Here, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and blooming roses, the silence between them was no longer tense, but companionable. They would work side by side, their hands in the soil, and they would talk. They spoke of small things, the weather, the stubbornness of weeds, the color of the sky. But beneath the surface of these simple words, a deeper truth was being exchanged. He was showing her the man he was before the world had demanded he be Silas Blackwood. And she was showing him the resilient, daring woman who had survived her own tragedies. The locked garden was no longer a place of sorrow. It was becoming a place of hope, a secret world where two lonely souls were tentatively, dangerously, learning to grow. The arrival of the letter was an intrusion, a crisp white harbinger of the world outside their secret garden. It was addressed to Isabella in a confident, looping script that was aggressively masculine. Silas saw it on the hall table first, the postmark from the nearby town of Sterling, and a cold, unfamiliar possessiveness coiled in his gut. He carried it to her, his expression unreadable, and held it out. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. As she broke the seal and read, he watched the color drain from her face. "It is from Mr. Davies," she said, her voice barely a whisper. A gentleman my father approved of, before." She didn't need to finish. Before her family's fortune was lost, and she had become a commodity for a survival marriage. "He is in redemption on business. He wishes to call upon me." The words hung in the air, a formal, polite request that felt like a declaration of war. Mr. Davies was the enforcer, the embodiment of the life Isabella might have had, a man who would see her as a prize and Silas as a jailer. According to the rigid etiquette of their society, Silas had no grounds to refuse the visit. To do so would be a public insult, an admission that his marriage was not the stable, respectable union he pretended it to be. It would invite scrutiny, gossip, speculation. It would risk everything. The choice was stark, a blade held to the throat of his carefully constructed world. He could be the stoic, magnanimous husband, allow the visit, and retreat behind his walls of emotional isolation, proving his marriage was nothing more than a practical arrangement. Or he could show his hand. He could risk his reputation, his control, everything, for a passion he had sworn never to feel. That evening, he found her in the garden. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and gold across the sky, and the air was fragrant with night-blooming jasmine she had planted. She stood by the stone wall, her silhouette a fragile, lonely shape against the dying light. "You should receive him," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He was testing her, testing himself. She turned to face him, her expression searching. "Is that what you want?" The loaded question, the quiet challenge, broke him. The control he had maintained for a decade, the vow he had made to a ghost, all of it shattered in the face of losing her, even for an afternoon, to another man. He crossed the few feet between them in 2 long strides. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a brand, a claim. "No," he said, his voice a low, ragged confession. "It is not what I want." He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her dusk dark eyes, at the tremble of her lips. "I do not want him to call on you, Isabella. I do not want any man to call on you but me." This was his midpoint, the choice to risk everything. The confession was not of love, not yet, but of a desperate, consuming desire that defied logic and safety. The air between them was electric, the unspoken finally given voice. She swayed toward him, a flower turning to a forbidden sun, and that small movement was all the permission he needed. He lowered his head and captured her lips in a kiss that was not gentle or tender, but desperate and ravenous. A decade of starvation poured into a single damning moment. It was a kiss of ruin, a kiss of revelation, stolen in the shadows of their secret, sacred space. And as they clung to each other, the world outside the garden walls, with its letters and its rules and its judging eyes, ceased to exist. The visit was an exercise in exquisite torture. Mr. Davies arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, a man whose polished boots and confident smile seemed to mock the rustic authenticity of the ranch. He was handsome, charming, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. As he sat in Silas's formal parlor, sipping tea he clearly found distasteful, his conversation was a masterclass in subtle condescension. He spoke of his travels, of his business successes, of the vibrant social life in Sterling, each word designed to highlight the quiet, isolated life Isabella now led. Silas remained standing by the fireplace, a silent, brooding sentinel. He had agreed to this torment, but every polite word from Davies's lips felt like a physical blow. He watched Isabella, who sat poised and pale on the settee, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a gracious hostess, answering Davies's questions with a cool dignity that betrayed none of the desperate passion they had shared in the garden. But Silas could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the faint, bruised look around her eyes. "It must be a great comfort, Isabella, to have found such stability," Davies said, his gaze flicking from her to Silas, a clear insinuation in his tone. "Though I confess I had imagined a different future for you, one with more life." "I have found a great deal of life here," Isabella replied, her voice steady, her eyes briefly meeting Silas's across the room. The glance was a secret, a reassurance, a shared act of defiance. Davies's smile tightened. He was not a fool. He sensed the current in the room, the invisible charged wire stretching between the rancher and his young wife. The visit was no longer a polite social call. It was an interrogation. He began to probe, asking seemingly innocent questions about their daily routines, about the ranch, about their neighbors. He was the enforcer, searching for a crack in the facade. "Blackwood here has quite the reputation," Davies continued, turning his attention to Silas. "A man of discipline, of restraint. The whole county looks up to him. It is a heavy burden, I imagine, to maintain such a standard." "The standards I set are my own," Silas said, his voice a low growl. The tension in the room was suffocating. Davies, sensing he had pushed enough for one day, finally rose to leave. At the door, he took Isabella's hand, holding it a moment too long, his thumb stroking her glove. "If you should ever find yourself in need of a friend," he said, his voice a conspiratorial murmur, for her ears only, but Silas saw it all. "You have only to send a word to Sterling." It was a threat, a promise, an offer of escape. After he was gone, a brittle silence descended. Isabella stood at the window, watching his buggy disappear down the long drive. "He knows," she whispered. "He doesn't know what it is, but he suspects something." The suspicion was a poison that now seeped beyond the walls of the ranch. Davies, slighted and intrigued, became a lingering presence in the town of redemption. He stayed on, citing business, but his real work was observation. He spoke to the shopkeepers, the mayor, the stable hands. And the gossip began, quiet at first, then louder. Whispers about the strange marriage at the Blackwood ranch, about the haunted look in the young bride's eyes, about the new, fierce possessiveness in the rancher's gaze. The secret that had once been confined to the house and the garden was now leaking into the world, and Mr. Davies was there, watching and waiting, eager to catch the flood. The fear of discovery became a constant, unwelcome guest. Every creak of a floorboard, every unexpected knock at the door, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Their stolen moments in the garden became fraught with a new, desperate tension, their whispers shadowed by the knowledge that they were being watched. Mr. Davies was a ghost haunting their lives. His presence felt even when he was unseen. The gossip he had seeded in town had taken root, and now, when Silas and Isabella rode into redemption, they were met with curious stares and sudden, hushed conversations. One moonless night, a longing too powerful to ignore drove Silas from his study. He needed to see her, to be with her in the one place that felt like theirs. He scribbled a hasty note, "The garden," now, and slipped it under her bedroom door, a silent, illicit summons. He took a roundabout path through the darkened house and out a side entrance, his movements as stealthy as a hunter's. The air was cool and still, the silence of the prairie immense. But as he neared the garden gate, a sound made him freeze. The soft crunch of a boot on the gravel path behind him. He melted back into the deep shadow of an oak tree, his heart pounding against his ribs. Peering around the trunk, he saw a figure moving with a furtive, deliberate stealth. Davies. The man's suspicion had escalated to stalking. He was following Silas, hoping to catch him in a transgression. A cold fury, followed by an even colder fear for Isabella, washed through Silas. She would be waiting for him in the garden, vulnerable, exposed. He had to lead Davies away. Sacrificing their meeting was the only choice. Silas abandoned his path to the garden and cut across the open yard, making just enough noise to ensure he was followed. He led Davies on a pointless, meandering chase toward the distant barns, his mind racing. He could hear the other man's footsteps behind him, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, a relentless predatory pursuit in the dark. He finally reached the main barn, slipping inside and pulling the heavy door almost closed, leaving only a crack to watch through. He waited, his breathing controlled, his body rigid. After a few tense moments, Davies appeared, a dark shape against the starlight. He hesitated, scanning the area, then swore under his breath in frustration. He had lost the trail. After another moment, he turned and stalked back toward the main road, a figure of impotent rage. Silas sagged against the rough wood of the barn wall, the adrenaline leaving him weak. The close call was a brutal reminder of the razor's edge they were living on. The danger was no longer a vague threat of gossip. It was a man's footsteps in the night, a physical, imminent peril. He made his way back to the house, the longing from earlier now replaced with a grim, sobering terror. He went to Isabella's door and listened. There was no sound. He pictured her in the garden, waiting for him, wondering why he hadn't come, alone in the dark. He couldn't protect her by meeting her in secret. He could only endanger her. The realization was a shard of ice in his gut. The walls he had built to protect his own heart were now the very thing that threatened to bring hers to ruin. The terror of the close call settled into a cold, hard certainty in Silas's heart. The secrecy that had felt like a thrilling, private world now felt like a trap, and he was horrified to realize he had led Isabella into it with him. He could not keep living this lie, could not ask her to share this risk, without giving her the full and terrible truth. The secret he had guarded for a decade, the one that defined and constricted his entire existence, had to be spoken. He waited until the house was deep in the sleep of night, until the moon was high and the world outside was silent. He went to her room, his knock a soft, hesitant sound against the heavy wood. She opened the door immediately, as if she had been waiting. She was dressed in a simple white nightgown, her dark hair unbound, her face pale and etched with worry from his absence in the garden. She looked at him, and her eyes held not a question of his whereabouts, but a deeper, more knowing inquiry. "Come with me," he said, his voice hoarse. He led her not to the garden, but to his study, the heart of his solitude. He lit a single lamp, keeping the room in deep shadow, and gestured for her to sit in the large leather chair opposite his desk. It was the chair reserved for business, for unwelcome visitors. Placing her there felt like a betrayal, but he needed the distance, the formality, to get through this. He remained standing, a caged, restless energy pulsing from him. "You have a right to know what it is you are risking," he began, his back to her as he stared out the window at the dark, indifferent land. "You have a right to know the man you married." He told her everything. He spoke of his first love, a girl named Clara, whom he had loved with the fierce, incautious passion of youth. He spoke of the accident, a fall from a wild horse on this very property, a horse he had been trying to break. He spoke of her dying in his arms, of the blood, of the terrible, final silence. He spoke of the town's whispers then, the pity mixed with condemnation, the way her family had looked at him as if he were a murderer. "I made a vow," on her grave," he said, his voice cracking, the sound a raw, ugly thing in the quiet room. "I swore I would never love again. I believe that I am a curse, that anything I touch with love, I destroy. My heart is a ruin, Isabella, a dangerous place." He finally turned to face her. "My marriage to you was meant to be a penance, a way to live a life of honor and duty without ever allowing my heart to engage. I offered you my name and my protection, but I was also using you as a shield against myself. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to feel anything for you." The confession hung in the air, a raw, gaping wound. He had expected her to be horrified, to be afraid. He had expected her to see him as he saw himself, a haunted man, a bringer of ruin. Isabella listened, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She did not cry or gasp. She simply absorbed the terrible weight of his story, the years of his self-imposed punishment. When he was finished, a long, heavy silence fell. He had given her the truth, and with it, the key to her own escape. She could leave now. No one would blame her. She rose from the chair and walked toward him, her movements fluid and deliberate in the shadows. She stopped just before him and raised a hand, not to his face, but to his chest, placing her palm flat over the frantic, terrified beating of his heart. "You are not a curse, Silas," she whispered, her voice filled with a strength that humbled him. "You are a man who has been grieving. Your heart is not a ruin. It is a garden that has been left untended for too long." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and certain. "I am not Clara," she said, the words a gentle absolution. "And I am not afraid." In that moment, she was not the tempted, but the redeemer. She saw his secret not as a danger to be fled, but as a wound to be healed. And as she stood before him, unafraid, he realized that the greatest risk was not in loving her, but in continuing to live without her. The fragile piece of their shared truth was not destined to last. Mr. Davies, fueled by a toxic combination of jealousy and wounded pride, had grown tired of whispering in the town's ear. He wanted proof, a weapon to destroy the man he saw as his rival and reclaim the woman he viewed as his property. He began to watch the house, not just at night, but during the day, learning its rhythms, its moments of quiet. And his attention was inevitably drawn to the one place that seemed to be the heart of the ranch's mystery, the locked garden. He found the same collapsed section of wall that Isabella had, and one afternoon, when he knew Silas was in town on business, and Isabella was presumably occupied indoors, he slipped inside. The garden was no longer a ruin. It was a thriving, intimate space filled with the evidence of shared labor and secret affections. And there, on a stone bench, half hidden under a rosebush, was the proof he needed. A small, embroidered handkerchief, delicate and fine, with the initial I stitched in the corner. Isabella's. He pocketed it with a triumphant, vicious smile. His confrontation came that Sunday, in the one place where the entire community was gathered, a captive audience. After the sermon, as the congregation milled outside the church, Davies made his move. He approached Silas and Isabella, his expression one of grave, false concern. "Reverend," he called out, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "A moment, if you please. I have a matter of some moral urgency to discuss." A circle of curious onlookers began to form. Silas instinctively moved to stand slightly in front of Isabella, a silent shield, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Blackwood," Davies said, his eyes gleaming with malice, "you present yourself as this town's moral compass, a man of honor. But I wonder if that honor extends to the secrets you keep locked away on your own property." He held up the handkerchief. "I found this," he announced, letting the crowd see the initial, "in a hidden, locked garden, a place I am told you forbid anyone from entering. It would seem your young wife, however, has a key." One wonders what sort of secret meetings necessitate such privacy. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The whispers that had been circulating for weeks now had a focal point, a piece of tangible evidence. The accusation was clear. An illicit affair, a deception happening right under their noses, conducted by the very man they held up as a paragon of virtue. The scandal had been exposed. He keeps her hidden away from the world, this child bride of his. Davies pressed on, his voice ringing with theatrical indignation. Is this the behavior of an honorable husband, or is it something more sinister? What are you hiding, Blackwood? The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of shock, suspicion, and a kind of hungry excitement. This was the climax, the moment of public reckoning. Silas felt the weight of 100 judging eyes. He could deny it, of course. He could retreat into his stoic silence, dismiss Davies as a jealous fool, and the town would eventually move on to another scandal. That was the safe path, the one that would lead him back to his cold, controlled solitude. But then he looked at Isabella. Her face was pale, but she was not cowering. Her chin was high, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. She looked not at the crowd, not at her accuser, but at him. And in her gaze he saw not the demand for rescue, but a silent, unwavering declaration of faith. She was not asking him to save her reputation. She was asking him to claim their truth. In that instant, his own secret, the curse he had carried for a decade, seemed a small, pathetic thing compared to the fierce, courageous love this woman offered him. The choice was no longer about his past, but about their future. Facing the ring of hostile, curious faces, Silas felt a profound and sudden clarity. The prison he had built for himself over the last 10 years was not made of stone or iron, but of fear of judgment, fear of grief, fear of love itself. And now, standing beside Isabella, he realized the prison door had been open all along. He had only needed the courage to walk through it. He did not look at Davies. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at his wife. He saw the woman who had faced down his ghosts, who had tended the abandoned garden of his heart, who was now facing public ruin with him, her gaze unwavering. Bolstered by her silent strength, he made his choice. He reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but in the charged atmosphere of the churchyard, it was a thunderous declaration. Her fingers, though cold, wrapped around his with a firm, steady pressure. It was not the grip of a frightened girl seeking protection, but the clasp of a partner, an equal. Turning to face the crowd, his voice rang out, clear and steady, devoid of the anger they expected, filled instead with an unshakable, quiet authority. "Mr. Davies is correct about one thing," he said, his words slicing through the murmurs. "The garden is a private place." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "It is where my wife and I have chosen to build our marriage. Not for the eyes of this town, not for the approval of Mr. Davies, but for ourselves." He held up their joined hands. "What my wife and I share is not a matter for public speculation or moral debate. It is ours." He offered no further explanation. He did not defend himself against the insinuation of an affair, for in a way it had been a secret, passionate affair of the heart, conducted under the guise of a formal marriage. He did not speak of his past, of Clara, of the curse. He owed them nothing of that. He owed his truth only to the woman standing beside him. With a final dismissive glance at Davies, whose face was a mask of thwarted rage, Silas turned his back on the crowd. "Let's go home, Isabella," he said softly, for her ears only. And together they walked away. They walked through the stunned, silent parting of the people, their footsteps the only sound. It was not a retreat, but a claiming. They were turning their backs on the judgment, the gossip, the suffocating expectations of a world that could never understand their truth. The scandal had broken, yes, but it had not broken them. It had forged them together, melting away the last vestiges of secrecy and pretense in its fiery crucible. As they walked toward their buggy, leaving the gasping heart of the town behind them, they were not a rancher and his child bride. They were a man and a woman who had chosen each other, openly and defiantly, in the full, unforgiving light of day. The ride back to the ranch was conducted in a profound, unbroken silence. The world they had left behind in the churchyard, the whispers, the accusations, the scandalized faces, seemed to belong to another lifetime. Now, the world had shrunk to the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves on the dusty road and the solid, warm presence of the person beside them. They were pariahs, exiles in their own land, but they were together. The air in the buggy was not tense, but thick with a strange, somber peace. When they reached the house, the familiar sight of it standing strong and solitary against the vast sky felt different. It was no longer a place of secrets and separate wings, but a fortress, their fortress. Silas helped Isabella down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist. Inside, the house was still and quiet, a silent witness to their transformation. This was the aftermath, the quiet reckoning. He led her to the parlor, the very room where Mr. Davies had sat in judgment of them, and for the first time he built a fire for her himself. He knelt on the hearth, the flames catching and casting a warm, dancing light across the room, pushing back the encroaching shadows of the afternoon. "They will never look at us the same way again," he said, his voice low, his back still to her. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He was giving her one last chance to regret her choice. "I was never looking at them," Isabella replied softly from her chair. "I was only ever looking at you." He turned then, and the look on his face was one of raw, unguarded vulnerability. All the years of stoic control had been stripped away, leaving the grieving, fearful man beneath. "I am afraid, Isabella," he confessed, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Not of them, of myself, the vow I made, the fear I have of bringing you to ruin." She rose and came to him, kneeling before him on the hearthrug, taking his larger, calloused hands in her own. "Your vow was made to a ghost, Silas. It was made by a boy who blamed himself for a tragedy he could not control. But you are not that boy anymore. And I," she said, her grip tightening, "am not a ghost." She looked at him, her gaze direct and full of a fierce, unwavering love. "I am not afraid. Whatever comes, we face it together. Your heart is not a curse. It is my own." Her words were the final, gentle absolution he had not known he was starving for. The redemption he sought was not in the eyes of the town, not in forgiving himself for the past, but in accepting the love that was being offered to him in the present. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, a gesture of surrender, of profound gratitude. The scandal still raged in the town beyond their gates, a fire they could not control. But in here, in the warm, quiet heart of their home, the real work had begun. They were no longer just surviving the consequences. They were starting to build a life from them. The aftermath of the storm was not a ruin, but a clearing, a space where something new and true could finally be allowed to grow. The days that followed the public confrontation were quiet, insular, and intensely focused. The town of redemption, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist for them. They were an island, their ranch, a self-sufficient world ordered by a sea of silent condemnation. No one called upon them. When Silas had to ride into town for essential supplies, he was met with averted gazes and the cold, impenetrable wall of polite ostracism. He bore it without flinching, his purpose now singular, the life he was building with Isabella. Their life together had truly begun. The vast, lonely house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of their partnership. They spoke of the future, of planting new crops in the spring, of repairing the northern fences, of the books they would read aloud by the fire during the coming winter. Their conversations were no longer coded or fraught with tension, but easy and open. The power balance had shifted from a guarded negotiation to a seamless collaboration. The garden, once their only secret sanctuary, was now simply an extension of their home. The gate was left unlocked, its purpose as a hidden refuge no longer necessary. One crisp autumn morning, Silas found Isabella there, turning over the soil in a new, uncultivated section. He came and stood beside her, watching as she worked. "What will you plant here?" he asked. She looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the bright sun with a dirt-smudged hand. "I'm not sure," she said, her smile open and easy. "Something resilient. Something that will survive the winter and bloom again, stronger." It was a metaphor for them, so plain and true, it needed no further comment. He knelt beside her in the rich, dark earth and began to work, his hands moving in rhythm with hers. This was their new reality, a future being built not on grand promises, but on small, shared acts of faith and labor. The scandal had left its mark. They would likely always be outsiders, their story a cautionary tale whispered in the town. Their future was fragile, a new shoot in a harsh climate. But as the sun warmed their backs and their hands worked together in the soil, they were not thinking of the town or the scandal. They were building their world from the ground up. Silas looked at Isabella, at the fierce, beautiful woman who had walked into the ruins of his life and had the courage to plant a garden. He had married her for survival his own, though he hadn't known it at the time. His secret had made her question everything, but her love had been the answer. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. It was a small touch, a micro-intimacy that held the weight of 1,000 vows. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment, a silent affirmation. Their vow was made not in words, but in this shared breath, in the quiet, defiant hope of a garden waiting for spring.